Otherwise, I'm just going to go back and forth.
Back and forth is okay.
Cool. Hey everyone, I'm Azat. Once again, sorry for being late. For those of you guys who've done high school debating, this is going to be relatively similar. It's going to be a couple new things for those of you guys who haven't. Be speaker roles. So basically, what you're theoretically supposed to do in each position, specifically for the upcoming nationals tournament, because obviously the formats change as we progress through the year. Cool. I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to start with what the underpinning ideology of what each of the speaker roles should kind of seek to achieve. And then we're going to go into a more granular level of what is involved in each part of the speech. So breaking down what's in a speech and we should talk about. The third part, we're just going to go through some examples and I guess interesting stuff that I wanted to mention. Also really out of breath because I was walking really quickly. So sorry about that. Cool. Principles. This is not to be confused with principled arguments about whether or not things are morally good or bad. This is the underlying principles of what each speaker role should seek to achieve or reach. On the left is the baseline of what dictates a good or bad fulfillment of this speaker role. Now on the right is, I guess, quote unquote, more advanced way of thinking about these roles. So the first speaker is the first substantive speaker, so they introduce all new arguments. But the most important part of the first speaker's role is to set up the foundation for the entire team's strategy and the entire team's arguments. We're going to go through some examples of that later on, but the most important part of fulfilling or being a good first speaker is presenting those arguments clearly and setting up those foundations for the rest of the debate. Obviously, the first speaker. At a more advanced level, better first speakers who deliver better speeches or better cases should seek to, or should attempt to at the very least, guess what the debate's going to fundamentally swing on or be about, and make an attempt to deliver arguments that preempt or are about those predictive ideas before they get presented at second or third. And we'll go through an example later on. But the difference between a good first speaker and some of the best first speakers in the world is simply the fact that the best first speakers in the world have done enough debates where they can pretty clearly and pretty accurately foresee what the likely arguments are going to arise, and in response, write those directly into your case. And as can hopefully be relatively intuitive, if the first affirmative speaker is able to make a series of arguments that preemptively wipe out what the first neg, second neg, and third neg could potentially say, that makes the first affirmative speech quite effective and quite useful. Moving on to the second speaker. Second speaker is probably the most dynamic of the 3 roles, which is to say that they do a bit of both. They do a bit of arguing in terms of presenting new arguments and new substantive, but they can also do a lot of rebuttal, a lot of defensive work in terms of bolstering some of the arguments that their first speaker maybe forgot, didn't get time to talk about, or just didn't think about, and also rebutting and dealing with what the negative team or the opposing team brings up in response. Obviously, we're going to go through some examples once again, but the general theory behind what kind of better second speakers tend to do is they try to delineate the case from the first speaker, because ideally the first speaker delivers the optimal or the complete case, and the second speaker is able to do things like case shift, so the throwing red herrings, the introduce new ways or new outcomes or new arguments that are unrelated, for example, to what the first speaker says, or is a substantially different or new way of winning the debate that is not contingent or reliant on the stuff that their first speaker has already said. The third speaker, their role is to explain to the adjudicator essentially why they have won the debate, to summarize or to introduce new ideas into the debate to explain why the arguments presented by their team are better and more effective than what the opposing team kind of introduces. So those are kind of the underlying ideas. Once again, this is pretty generalized and vague. We're going to go through specific examples as we move on. Any questions? Yeah, what's up?
Can the third speaker bring new ideas that hasn't been discussed before?
Great question. We're going to get to that when we talk about it. Before we, I guess, talk about what each speaker is allowed, quote unquote, to say and not allowed to say, I'm going to quickly go through an example of strategy, because this is just the one that I'm going to come back to. Basically, the affirmative team strategy is to say the topic is a good idea, and here's like a bunch of reasons and arguments and examples for why that thing is something we should do. The negative team, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not that much more complicated. Generally, you just want to say that what the affirmative team is proposing is bad, or that there is an alternative way of doing the thing that the affirmative team is trying to do. The caveat to this is there are restrictions on what the negative team can and can't do, which is to say that if they try to mirror and copy what the affirmative team is doing, then that is a violation of the rules, because the negative team is supposed to be disagreeing with the affirmative team. So if they end up agreeing with them in whatever way that they agree, there's probably some problems with what the negative team is trying to do. The fancy term for this is squirreling, but basically if you're making arguments that are very similar to the affirmative team, you might realize that you have gone wrong, at least in some aspect of your strategy. Cool, the reason I bring this up is we're going to go through some examples. So for example, the negative team might say that instead of banning smoking, we can regulate it, which might be a better way of dealing with it. Or they might just say banning smoking is bad for myriad reasons. Some might say that banning smoking is bad because it reduces people's autonomy. Some people say it's bad because it increases smoking, the health risks of smoking, lots of things that you could say. Here's another example. Instead of banning, instead of socializing Medicare or medical care, we should privatize it, or we can just say that socializing healthcare makes it less accessible for whatever reason that the negative team cannot come up with. Obviously, there's generic kind of strategies that you can run. Cool. Everything else is kind of the same idea, but depending on the topic type, you can't do the second thing. For example, if you're doing an empirical motion or an opposed motion, there is no second win strategy that is available to the negative team. You kind of just have to say that this thing isn't true, or this thing is good, or this thing is bad. But basically, the negative team just has to say the opposite thing to what the affirmative team is trying to argue for. Cool. The reason that I'm going through all of this is I'm going to bring it up when we get to the contents of each speaker. Cool. So this is what is in each speech. The thing I want to note here is the way that debating is scored is that we get numbers for the speech, i.e. speaker score and the result, but the way that it's actually marked isn't how tests are kind of traditionally marked, which is to say, if you miss out on any of the things I'm talking about or include extra things, you're not going to get a bonus +1 mark or a bonus minus mark. You're not going to auto lose debates to do certain things. It's just that the tendency is, if you remember to do most of these things, your arguments tend to be better and your speeches tend to be better. So just because you forget to do some of this stuff doesn't mean you auto lose the debate, but generally remember to do a lot of these things will help your speech be more persuasive and generally makes your arguments better and your case better. Cool, we're going to go in chronological order. So the first speaker, like I said earlier, has the goal of introducing the arguments and the strategy of their team and establishing kind of the foundations of how the debate operates. So the foundations are what the setup refers to, which is to say, if there is a debate about changing something which the government is introducing, so for example, if we talk about smoking, then it requires an explanation of what this process would actually involve and look like. Because there are a myriad of ways that you could ban smoking. You can execute people that you find to be vaping, or you could give them a fine, or you could do this legally, or you can do this in specific areas. The setup just refers to how you're going to introduce this model, the solution, or how the team is going to implement the change that they're referring to. Substantive just refers to arguments. Principle refers to moral kind of deontological arguments. People do philosophy. If you don't, it's just an argument about whether or not something is moral. A practical argument is about the consequentialist argument, so whether or not the consequences of doing something is good or bad for people or for different groups. So that's what the first substantive speaker should have. They should have a clear setup, they should have a clear explanation of what they're doing, what the team is going to do in the debate, and have one or two key arguments about why the thing that they're doing is good or bad, or depending on what side you're on. That obviously changes. Does that make sense? Cool. Second responsive. So color coding. Red is stuff that is not like illegal bad, but it just doesn't get counted. So in debating, if you do things that are not allowed, essentially what the adjudicator does is they just pretend you haven't said those things and they don't consider that in the decision-making process. So if you make a bunch of arguments that you're not allowed to make, or if you suddenly change the setup or the model at second speaker, which is not really allowed, then what the adjudicator is going to do is they're not going to dock you mark, you're not going to auto lose the debate if you do that. They're just going to pretend that part of your speech is just missing, and they're just going to consider all the other arguments that you've made. When we talk about second responsive, you obviously have the right of reply to what the opposing first speaker has said. So they have a series of arguments to explain why the topic and the thing that you're introducing is a bad idea or a good idea or whatever. It's up to you to defend against their arguments and explain the opposite, i.e. why you agree with the topic that you're arguing for and why it's a good idea or why it's a bad idea, stuff like that. Referring to substantive, this is what I talk about in terms of introducing a new pathway. There's also different ways that speakers will recommend you guys do this. The idea is you don't have to have a new argument at second speaker, but the more arguments you have, the higher likelihood you have of winning, just because it means that the negative team or the team that you're debating against has more stuff to deal with and more stuff they need to argue against. And like I just mentioned, you're not allowed to change the model or change the setup after it has occurred. So if I'm the first affirmative speaker and the topic is about banning smoking, and I say that we're going to allocate $100 million to the process of banning smoking and making it illegal, and then the negative team comes out and points to the fact that this is probably a waste of resources and we can, spend it on advertising campaigns or things like that. I can't then at second speaker say, actually no, we're gonna, increase our funding and also spend it on advertising campaigns. Because not only does that contradict what my first speaker has said, that's me changing the model in a new and drastic way that would mean that it just becomes a debate about, oh, we're gonna keep changing things until, teams get too tired over debating how we're going to solve the problem rather than whether or not the solution is an effective one. Make sense? Cool. Third responsive. So this is the speech where you do most of the responsive work, i.e. you're doing most of the rebuttal, most of the explanation for why your side is the better side in comparison to the opponent's, and specifically you should be trying to group your explanations in a way that explains really clearly to the adjudicator why you've won for very specific and clear reasons. So the way that most people kind of explain this is you want to group ideas that are similar together. So if we talk about the smoking debate, you might have one group of explanation that essentially elucidates why it is that you improve the healthcare for specific groups of people. And then you might have a second group, which is about whether or not this is a efficient allocation of government resources. And so by explaining that you improve the healthcare outcomes, that outcome is a tangible one that you can explain to the adjudicator to be a persuasive reason for why you might implement the policy, assuming you're able to prove that the healthcare improvements actually accrue. The stuff that you are allowed to do, and this is to directly answer your question, Wyatt, in blue. So you can introduce new examples, new explanation, new analysis, new impact, new weighing, just different stuff, but you're not allowed to introduce a new argument that hasn't been referenced or hasn't been made earlier. So if the entirety of the first and second speaker's speech are about the health benefits of smoking, and then the third speaker comes up and starts talking about how this benefits the tobacco industry, that would be considered a new argument about a new group of people that hasn't already been mentioned in the debate. So the general rule of thumb is, if they haven't really been explicitly referenced or talked about, you should be wary about the way that you explain it. And especially if it's a new argument about new outcomes and stuff like that, it's generally something that will be considered to be less impactful on the decision of the adjudicator. And the reason for this is just some people don't get the right of reply, i.e. third negative doesn't get someone to respond to them. So if they come up with 8 minutes of new analysis, it's really unfair to the affirmative team. So that's the kind of thinking behind why there's some restrictions on what the third speaker can do and can't do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions? Cool.
One question.
Yeah, go for
as first speaker, is it a necessity to introduce your team's arguments, like as first speaker, I'll do the second?
Short answer is no.
Okay.
In terms of the game theory of this, you're just providing more information than is necessary. Like if your second speaker has like a jump argument, like an argument that's unexpected, it's kind of counterintuitive as the affirmative team to kind of say we're going to have this new fancy argument and give them extra time to prepare. Obviously, you're not making the argument until you get the second speaker. If you're taking it really seriously, you don't need to Generally, you don't have to. Hopefully that answers that. Cool. Let's go through some examples about what you might actually include in each of these speakers and these speaker positions. Okay.
Yeah, so you don't have to provide it and like a clear outline, but you have to set up something general, right, for what your whole team will discuss, right? Like that's what the setup is, isn't it? Like underlying ideas.
Yeah, so I guess the difference is if I'm first affirmative on the smoking debate, I might have an introduction going like, we think smoking causes a lot of health harms. We think that banning it is the most effective way to ameliorate these health harms at a national level. That's why, as the affirmative team, we're going to ban smoking in this way. And you continue on your arguments. You can go, for example, talk about how this specifically, impacts neighborhoods who lack education or neighborhoods who have a higher likelihood of smoking. But if that's the argument being made by your second speaker, you would just let the second speaker make it rather than signposting it, because you're just mentioning it but not explaining it, so you would essentially just be repeating yourself. Does that example answer? Cool.
So the third speaker, I think you said that if you definitely are allowed to bring up new people that like benefited or negatively impacted. What if like this is for the type of smoking that is good for men for X, Y, Z reasons. Second speaker brings up the fact that it's better for the mental health or whatever X, Y, Z. And
Yep.
the third speaker still speaks about men, but they bring up a new argument saying that it's better for their health X, Y, Z reason. Would that be considered a new argument? What would that be?
I'm going to give you a semi-cryptic answer, which is sometimes it depends on the adjudicator. Some adjudicators are very kind of stone, very like following the letter of the rule, letter of the law. I don't know what the analogy is. Yeah, sometimes they're very strict on whether or not it's counted. The general rule of thumb is you could probably make that argument. You just have to link it explicitly with what you've already said, or i.e. what the first speaker said. So you would go like, my first speaker explained this impact, my second speaker explained this impact. These analyses which have already been explained lead to this outcome. So you're drawing the explicit link. So if you're ever in doubt, that's what I would do. I would directly link it to what's already been said.
So what if second speaker just says generic smoking is better for men, and then third speaker says this is how it's going to be better for men. It's alright, it's got small health benefits. I'm guessing it's kind of on the line.
I think it would depend on how the argument is actually made, but by the sound of it, seems okay. Yeah. And I guess it's more of a teeter on the line through experience, and then you'll get a kind of better feel for what would be considered new and what isn't.
In terms of the second speaker and not changing the model, how strictly is the line drawn? Like if, for example, if we talk about the smoking thing,
Yep.
like if the first speaker says we want to advertise or whatever, and the first negative's like, how are you going to fund that? And then the second speaker says, by doing X, Y, Z, does that count as changing the model, or are you just clarifying something?
I guess the rule of thumb is contradictions or added explanations would be considered new. So if there's one way of funding that is explicitly explained at first, and you contradict it directly, or indirectly even at second speaker, that would be considered a problem or a knife, and that second speaker's explanation will be ignored. If we're talking about, I guess, your specific example, i.e., I have a model about funding the ban on smoking, and then the first neg raises a pretty kind of understandable argument about, well, where's the money coming from? I think it would be reasonably okay for the second affirmative to explain where the money would likely come from, unless first affirmative specifies in a way that makes it implausible for the second speaker's explanation to make sense.
Okay.
So if the first speaker doesn't have an explanation, and then the first neg asks about it, second affirmative's explanation would probably work.
So you're allowed to like add something if there's
Yes.
another gap. Okay.
Sorry, that was probably a really long-winded answer to the question. Cool. First substantive example. This is a trial topic we used from last week, so I'm just using it as an example. So, What you might do in setup, and obviously like I mentioned earlier, this isn't an exhaustive list. Just because you didn't make this argument doesn't make your speech terrible. Just because you made arguments different to this doesn't make your speech terrible. It's just suggestions of what you might do. So in your setup, you might explain that there's an inequity in the status quo, and that the solution of taxing women and their income less than men would be an amelioration or a solution to this problem. That would be your setup. So you would explain what this tax decrease or a tax cut would look like and what this would likely lead to. And then you would present some arguments for why this is a good idea. It's maybe good for women, maybe it's good for men, maybe it's good for society or economy or whatever. And then you would presumably add explanation in that argument for why those things are true, why those things are good. Up here is one example of structure that is commonly used. You don't have to use this structure like I said before, but this is the easiest way to kind of break down arguments and generate ideas that are useful for those arguments. We're probably going to go through this separately as a seminar on its own, because there's a lot of small things in here that require breaking down. But generally, you want to describe background context in the first segment, which is characterization. So you might talk about what an increase in income tax would, a decrease in income tax and an increase in discretionary spending would actually look like. You would explain why that would be beneficial for people's quality of life and women's quality of life. Then you might explain the specific effects of being able to buy certain things or finding it easier to buy certain things. For kind of people who are pretty comfortable with this, there's two new ideas, I guess, that you may or may not have seen before, which is explaining why certain outcomes are important and comparing those outcomes against what the opposing team is likely to raise. So just because you prove that women's quality of life improves, it's not necessarily the case that this debate is only about women's quality of life. It's very likely that there's a series of other outcomes which arise. So it's up to you as a debater to explain why this specific outcome is the more important one that the adjudicator should find to be more persuasive and to care more about in their decision making than maybe an outcome about the economics of like increased spending or whatever. Cool. Any questions about this? Cool. First thing. So, like I said before, you kind of have two strategies available to you. The first one is to explain that this makes the problem worse, which is to say that somehow reducing the income tax for women makes the inequality in the status quo bigger. The second way you can do this is you can explain an alternative solution to the problem that's being raised. So you would go like, oh, yeah, we agree, maybe it's a bit screwed up and a bit inequitable in the status quo, but instead of reducing income tax, here's a series of other solutions which the negative team would propose in order to fix this problem. The thing I would note here is, as a very basic rule of thumb, you're only allowed to spend as much as the affirmative team spends. So for example, if we're reducing income tax on the affirmative team, that means the government's collecting less tax, which means that there is going to be a budget shortfall, there's going to be less money in the economy. But if the negative team drastically spends more money than the affirmative team proposes to cut, then that would be unfair. Like if I put a 5% income tax cut on the affirmative team, and then the negative team goes like, I'm going to spend $1 trillion in the budget on this alternative solution, that would be drastically unbalanced and it would not be allowed for the negative team. Or at the very least, the negative team would somehow have to explain where the $1 trillion comes from and how that is equal or similar to the 5% tax cut which the affirmative team is making. So that's a way of kind of solving this, I guess, strategical difference, which is to say that the negative team can propose a series of alternatives, but those alternatives must roughly cost the same amount as what the affirmative team is proposing.
If first act doesn't provide a model or a clear model, as first neg, can we still give a model?
Yeah, 100%. So if I get up and go like, we should definitely do this because it reduces the inequity for women, and the reason for why having more money is great is for these reasons. At no point have I actually substantiated or clearly outlined what this tax cut looks like. The negative team can get up and go like, well, instead of cutting tax, we should do this other thing. But if I instead get up and say, they haven't proposed a model, so what the negative team is going to do is we're going to spend 50% of our GDP reallocating funds for social distribution, that would be a very clear kind of violation of what the negative team is allowed to do. So just use common sense, I guess. But the short answer to your question is yes. Even if there's no clear model, we can still provide a counter model. Only if the topic allows models. Yeah, that's the other thing. Cool. here are some examples of practicals and principles you can run on the neg. So how this changes women's quality of life, how the status quo changes, how this is related to state power and consent. Cool, second responsive. What might the second speaker do? So you would explain why the negative team's proposed alternative is going to be less effective than your model. That is to say, if the negative team's counter model is we would reallocate this in some way, your job as a second affirmative speaker is to say, no, a reduction of income tax is more effective than reallocation for these reasons. And that's how you would directly compare and engage and rebut, I guess, what the first negative team says. You might introduce a new argument about how this improves the economic productivity of a country or improves the innovation because there's more kind of spending or whatever. These are just things I came up with off the top of my head. Does this make sense? Cool. Like I said before, you don't have to do the green stuff. It's just an option that's available. It obviously depends from debate to debate. Cool. Third responsive. So this is an example of how you might group issues or kind of similar ideas together and explain why your team, i.e. the affirmative team, does a better job of kind of meeting those outcomes or solving the problem or providing a solution than the negative team. Which is to say, if the debate does end up being about women's quality of life and the inequities that they are faced with currently, then the affirmative team should structure, or the third affirmative speaker should structure their first kind of question or the first chunk of their speech towards talking about why they very clearly bring about better change and better outcomes for the specific group of people that they're talking about. The second question that's in green, which is the optional one, is dependent on if debates are actually about multiple things or if about one thing. So if both teams agree that women's quality of life and current inequities is the most important topic in the debate, then there's no reason explaining why that general idea is important. Because both teams have agreed that that's the thing that they're trying to improve. However, what might be useful underneath this is to explain why certain forms of improvement or certain forms of inequity might be more important than others. So on the affirmative team, it might be advantageous to talk about how financial inequity is particularly constrictive or particularly harmful for women, and explain why it's the most important thing that needs to be improved. And obviously that's easier to do when you're reducing the income tax and giving them more money. The negative team might have an incentive to do the inverse, which is to explain why financial incentives or financial inequity in the status quo is particularly bad, particularly harmful, not something that's really important when we're talking about the current inequities structurally faced by women in society. Those are some examples. You don't have to structure things based off their kind of themes. Like I said before, you're not going to lose points or lose the debate because of it. It just makes it easier to structure things. It makes it easier for the adjudicator to follow, and it's also easier for you to do more as a third speaker if things are structured based off outcomes rather than done chronologically. Because the problem that you run into as you're doing things chronologically is there's a tendency to repeat analysis because speakers will generally be talking about similar things. So you might be repeating rebuttal or repeating explanation 2 or 3 times if first, second, and third speaker are all talking about it. So that's kind of the general rule or the general way that you would structure these. Cool. These are the motions. Does anyone have questions before?
We haven't done teams yet.
We can do let's do the draw.
Hi,